My name is Margot Sinclairius, and before I tell you what my husband did, I need you to understand who I was before he did it. I was not a naive woman. I want that established from the very first line, because everything that follows will sound, to some ears, like the story of a woman who should have seen it coming and didn't. I was 44 years old. I had spent 20 years as a dramaturg, which is a word most people outside the theater don't know, but which means in its simplest form, that I was paid to find the truth buried underneath a story, the real motive under the character's stated one, the historical fact under the playwright's invention. I was good at it. I was, by every account of the people who worked with me, exceptional at it. I could sit in a rehearsal room and tell you within the first 10 minutes exactly what a script was lying about. I could not, for 11 years, see the lie in my own kitchen. I had a foundation with my mother's name on it, a portfolio I managed with more care than most people manage their own children, and a marriage to a man named Nathaniel Reyes that I would have described, right up until an October morning 3 months before this story truly begins, as the single most solid structure in my life. He was a Broadway producer, 5 Tony Awards, the kind of man who made a room reorganize itself around him without ever raising his voice. I had watched him hold my hand through 2 miscarriages. I had watched him cancel his own opening night to sit with me in a hospital room. I had built over 14 years, an entire understanding of who he was, brick by brick, out of 1,000 small tendernesses. I am telling you this now at the start because I want you to know exactly how far there was to fall. This is not a story about a woman who suspected something was wrong and finally found the proof. This is a story about a woman who trusted completely, and was wrong to, and what she did once she understood exactly how wrong. This is the year my marriage ended, and the year I learned precisely what I was capable of when someone tried to take everything from me quietly, and count on my silence to let them keep it. The magazine was open to page 47 when I stopped breathing. I hadn't meant to see it. I'd meant to skim Playbill Quarterly the way I skimmed everything that came across my desk that morning, a headline, a photo caption, a name I recognized, and then on to the next thing because that was the rhythm of my life now at 44 years old and running the foundation my husband had built his empire beside. But my eye had caught on the woman in the photograph before my mind had caught up to why, and by the time I understood what I was looking at, I had already read the caption 3 times. Adrienne Cole, breakout star of Gilded Cage, photographed backstage at the Lyceum. She was laughing at something off camera, her head tipped back, one hand raised to touch her ear. And on that hand, catching the flash of the photographer's light in a way that no costume jeweler could fake, was my mother's ring. I would know that ring anywhere. 3 carats, cushion cut, set in a band of rose gold that had been hand-engraved by a jeweler on the Rue de la Paix in 1958, a gift from my father to my mother on their 10th anniversary, and after my mother died, a gift from me to no one, because I had put it in the safe in Nathaniel's study and told myself I would give it to a daughter one day. A daughter we never had. A daughter the doctors told me, for separate times over 4 separate years, I would likely never have. I sat at my desk in the foundation office on West 57th Street with the magazine open in front of me, and I did not move for what the clock on the wall told me was 11 minutes. I know this because when I finally looked up it was 10:47, and when I had sat down to read it had been 10:36. I have been married to Nathaniel Reyes for 14 years. He is one of the most respected theatrical producers in New York. 5 Tony Awards, a star on nobody's Walk of Fame because he's never wanted his name in lights, only the shows he built. I met him when I was 28 and working as a dramaturg for a regional theater in Chicago, and he was already, even then, a man who could make a room rearrange itself around him without raising his voice. I fell in love with the quiet certainty of him. I fell in love with the way he really listened to every actor, every stagehand, every intern who had an idea worth hearing. I did not know, on that October morning 11 years later, that I had fallen in love with a man who did not exist. I did not confront him that day. I want to be clear about that because everything that came after depended on the 11 minutes of stillness at my desk, and the 3 weeks that followed it, in which I did something I had never done in 14 years of marriage. I lied to my husband quietly, completely, and without a flicker of guilt. I started with the ring. I called the jeweler's estate in Paris. The original house still existed, run now by a great-grandson who kept meticulous digital records of every piece his family had ever touched, and asked if they had done any recent servicing or appraisal work on a piece matching that description. They had. 6 months earlier. Commissioned by a Nathaniel Reyes. shipped to an address in the West Village that was not our address. I wrote the address down on the back of a foundation grant letter and stared at it the way you stare at a word in a language you used to speak fluently and have suddenly forgotten. Then I did what I do best, which is research. I had spent 20 years as a dramaturg before I stopped working to run the foundation, and a dramaturg's entire education is the art of finding the true story underneath the story that's being told on stage, the historical truth. Beneath the playwright's invention, the psychological truth beneath a character's stated motive. I applied that education to my own marriage with the cold thoroughness I had once applied to Chekhov. Adrienne Cole was 26 years old. According to the 3 interviews she'd given, 1 to a theater blog, 2 to trade publications, she had trained privately before her Broadway debut 18 months earlier in a small ensemble role in a Nathaniel Reyes production. She had no listed conservatory, no listed agent until 14 months ago, no public history before the age of 24. When she appeared fully formed, as if she had been built in a workshop and switched on. I found the workshop. It took me 3 weeks. For private investigators I paid in cash through the foundation's discretionary account, and 1 deeply uncomfortable conversation with our accountant, whom I asked, under the pretense of a routine audit, to pull every wire transfer Nathaniel had authorized personally, outside the company's standard payroll, over the past 3 years. There were 41 of them. They totaled just under $2.3 million. Rent on an apartment on Bank Street, paid quarterly, under the name of a shell entity called Cole Arts Initiative, which I discovered existed on paper for exactly one purpose, which was to make monthly disbursements to Adrienne Cole that could be described, if anyone ever asked, as a scholarship. Voice lessons with a coach who charged $800 an hour. A dialect coach. A movement coach. 2 years of therapy, which I found almost unbearably ironic, paid for by the very man footing the bill for the deception that would eventually necessitate it. A car service contract. A standing account at a boutique on Bleecker Street. And the ring. The Cole Arts Initiative had 1 signatory besides the accountant of record, Nathaniel Reyes. But it was not the money that broke something loose in my chest. It was the identity. Adrienne Cole's real name, buried in a single old casting workshop registration from when she was 19, the only document in the entire 8-year trail that hadn't been carefully scrubbed, was Adrienne Voss. Voss had been my mother's maiden name. I need you to understand what my marriage looked like from the outside because I need you to understand what it cost me to see what it actually was. Nathaniel and I did not have children. We tried, in the brutal clinical way that trying comes to mean once you've been doing it long enough. 4 rounds of IVF, 2 miscarriages, the second one at 17 weeks, far enough along that we had already foolishly started calling the baby by a name. Nathaniel held my hand through every appointment. He canceled a Broadway opening night, his own show, a show he had spent 3 years building, to sit with me in a hospital room after the second miscarriage, and when I apologized, sobbing, for ruining his evening, he had taken my face in both hands and said, "You are not a disappointment to me. You have never once been a disappointment to me. Do you understand?" I had believed him. I had built the last 6 years of my life, my sense of my own worth, my understanding of my marriage around that sentence. While he was saying it, he was funding an apartment for a 24-year-old woman who shared my mother's maiden name, grooming her into a career, and I would learn later, though I did not yet know it, that October morning, raising in secret a 2-year-old boy named August. I found August in the 5th week of my investigation, in a single photograph on a private Instagram account that Adrienne Cole had forgotten to make fully private, a slip so small it might have taken another investigator months to find, but I was not looking casually. I was looking the way you look for a body you already suspect is buried somewhere on the property. The photo showed a birthday party. A single candle, a smash cake, Adrienne laughing. Behind the child, and in the background, blurred, cropped at the shoulder because whoever took the photo had clearly tried to keep him out of frame and mostly succeeded, a man's hand resting on the back of a chair. On that hand was a wedding ring I recognized because I had put it on his finger myself, in a garden in the Hudson Valley, 14 years earlier. I sat with that photograph for a long time, longer than the 11 minutes at my desk. I sat with it until the apartment around me, our apartment, the one overlooking Central Park that Nathaniel had bought the year his 4th show won Best Musical, the one where I had recovered from 2 miscarriages in a bed he never once left empty beside me, began to feel like a stage set. Beautiful. Load-bearing. Entirely false. I thought about every fertility appointment. Every injection I'd given myself in the bathroom because I didn't want him to see my hands shake. Every time he had told me it didn't matter, that I was enough, that our life was full exactly as it was. I thought about the particular tenderness with which he had always changed the subject whenever anyone at a dinner party asked, lightly, if we were thinking of adopting. "We're happy as we are," he would say, and squeeze my hand under the table. And I had thought, God help me, I had thought it was one of the most loving things a man could say to a grieving wife. He had already had his child. He simply hadn't had it with me. I did not scream. I did not throw anything, though I understood in an abstract way that other women in my position might have. I have spent my entire professional life inside the architecture of narrative. I know how stories are built. I know what a climax requires and what it costs a character to reach one. And some clear-eyed part of me understood that if I confronted Nathaniel in that moment, in the raw first days of knowing, I would hand him the single advantage he did not yet have: time to prepare a version of events that made him sympathetic. So instead, I did something that I think would have terrified him more than screaming ever could have. I got quiet. I got organized. I became, for 3 more weeks, the wife he thought he knew, attentive, warm, present at his side at a benefit gala for a children's hospital where he gave a moving speech about the importance of family that I listened to with my hands folded and my face composed, while beside me in my clutch was a flash drive containing 8 years of financial records that would end his career, his marriage, and quite possibly his freedom, depending on how the fraud counsel I had quietly retained wanted to characterize the misuse of foundation-adjacent funds. Because here is the detail that made this so much worse than an ordinary infidelity, the detail that turned my grief into something colder and more useful. Some of the money funding Adrienne Cole's apartment, her lessons, her ring, had been routed, cleverly, but not cleverly enough, through accounts connected to the Sinclair Family Foundation. My foundation? My mother's name on the letterhead. He had used my dead mother's philanthropic legacy, the one thing I had left of her besides a piece of jewelry he had since stolen and regifted to her namesake, to fund the son he'd had with another woman. I called Harold Whitfield on a Tuesday morning. Harold had been my family's attorney for 30 years, had drafted my parents' wills, had sat beside me at both funerals, and had 6 years earlier quietly drafted the prenuptial agreement that Nathaniel had signed without complaint because he had, at the time, so much less money than I did, and had wanted, he said, to prove that he wasn't marrying me for it. "Margot," Harold said when I told him what I'd found, and I heard something shift in his voice, the particular gentleness of a man who has spent 3 decades being the person people call when their lives come apart. "Are you safe?" "I'm not in danger, Harold. I'm angry." I said it flatly and I meant it. "I want to know exactly what the prenup says about fraud and misappropriation of foundation assets, and I want to know it by Friday. Margot. And I want you to find out who else has access to the Cole Arts Initiative filings. Because I don't think Nathaniel did all of this alone. Men like him don't do their own paperwork." There was a pause, the sound of a pen against paper, the particular silence of a man deciding not to ask the question he wants to ask, which was, I suspect, "Are you sure?" Harold had known me a long time. He knew I would not have called if I wasn't. "I'll have it by Thursday," he said instead. The name that came back to me on Thursday was Priscilla Okafor, the CFO of Nathaniel's production company, a woman I had known for a decade, who had come to our home for Christmas dinners, who had cried at our wedding. She had signed off as the second authorized officer on 11 of the 41 transfers. Whether she had known what they were for, or had simply trusted her boss's signature the way employees do, I did not yet know. But it meant the deception had a structure. It had accomplices, even unwitting ones. It had been built the way Nathaniel built everything, carefully, with contingency, with an eye toward what would happen if someone eventually looked too closely. He had simply never imagined that the someone would be me. I think, if I'm honest, that this was his single greatest miscalculation, and it is the miscalculation men like him always make. They spend so much energy managing the world outside the marriage, the mistress, the child, the money, the lawyers, the shell companies, that they stop managing the marriage itself because they have decided, somewhere in the quiet architecture of their own justification, that the wife is handled, settled, a known quantity who will keep being exactly what she has always been, grateful and grieving and easy to reassure. With a held hand and a well-timed sentence about how she is enough. I let him believe that for 3 weeks. I brought him coffee in the mornings. I asked about a revival he was casting, an Ibsen play, And I remember he looked up from his script with real warmth in his face and said, "You always did understand this stuff better than my dramaturgs." And I smiled and said something about the third act needing work, and the entire time some new, colder version of myself was cataloging the way he held his coffee cup, the way his wedding ring caught the kitchen light, filing it all away as evidence in a case I was building against a man I had once have built my whole life around. I did not cry again after that first night with the photograph of August. I want to say that plainly because I think people expect a woman in my position to dissolve, and there is a kind of story, the kind Nathaniel himself might have produced actually if it had been fiction and not his own life, that wants the wounded wife weeping in silk robes, drinking wine alone at 2 a.m., calling her sister at midnight to sob into the phone. That is not what happened to me. What happened to me is that I got still and clear and extremely competent in the specific way that grief sometimes curdles into. The confrontation when it came was not the one Nathaniel expected, because he did not know it was happening until it was already over. He was in the West Village apartment, the Bank Street address, on a Thursday evening. I know this because I had, by then, hired someone whose job was simply to tell me where he was on any given night, a piece of surveillance so far beneath the dignity of the woman I had been 3 months earlier that I sometimes marveled, distantly, at how easily I had adopted it. He told me he was at a producer's dinner. He was, instead, 30 blocks south, in an apartment I had paid for without knowing it, sitting on a sofa I had never seen, beside a woman who shared my mother's name in front of a 2-year-old boy who shared, according to the single clear photograph I had managed to obtain, Nathaniel's exact chin. I did not go there. I want to be clear about that too. I was not interested in a scene on someone else's territory, in becoming the wronged wife who shows up and screams in a doorway while a toddler cries in the next room. That was his stage. I had spent my whole career learning that the person who controls the venue controls the story, and I was not going to hand him one more advantage. Instead, at 9:14 p.m. on that Thursday, while he was 30 blocks south believing himself hidden, I sat in Harold Whitfield's office on Park Avenue with 2 forensic accountants, a fraud attorney named Denise Ruiz whom Harold had brought in for her expertise in exactly this kind of structured financial concealment, and a folder 11 inches thick. We did not call Nathaniel that night. We built the case instead. Denise explained in the careful language of a woman who has spent 20 years watching wealthy men believe themselves untouchable, precisely what we had. Clear evidence of a pattern of fund diversion from a non-profit foundation, my mother's foundation, to underwrite a wholly separate, undisclosed household, including, in 3 instances, the direct use of foundation letterhead and tax documentation to characterize personal gifts as charitable disbursements. That, she said, wasn't just grounds for a devastating divorce settlement. Depending on how aggressively the foundation's board, of which I was chair, wanted to pursue it, it was potentially a federal matter. You could destroy him, Denise said, not unkindly, more as a simple statement of the physics involved. Financially, professionally. He would likely lose the ability to produce commercially in New York theater again. Possibly ever. I sat with that for a long moment, the way I had sat with the photograph, the way I had sat at my desk on that first October morning. I don't want to destroy the shows, I said finally. The people who work on them didn't do this. The actors, the crew, the composers who've spent years of their lives on productions he still has running. I'm not going to let 200 people lose their jobs because of what one man did in a rented apartment on Bank Street. I looked at Harold. But I want every dollar traced back to the foundation returned with interest from his personal accounts, not the company's. I want the prenup enforced to its absolute limit, the infidelity clause, the fraud clause, all of it. And I want him to be the one who has to explain to the board in person exactly what he did with my mother's money. And the child? Harold asked gently. He had known by then everything I knew. Margot, there's a little boy in the middle of this who didn't ask for any of it. I had thought about August more than I had let myself say aloud. I thought about him at night sometimes, this small stranger who had, without meaning to, occupied the exact shape of the child I had grieved 4 times over, in 4 different hospital rooms. I did not hate him. I want that understood clearly. Whatever I felt toward Adrienne Cole, and it was not simple, it was not clean, it was something closer to a cold and total contempt, because she had known every single day, exactly what she was doing and to whom. I did not extend one particle of that feeling to a 2-year-old. I'm not going to make this about the child, I said. Nathaniel will provide for him. That's not in question. And it's not something I want to fight. I just don't want one more cent of it coming from money that has my mother's name on it. Denise nodded slowly, the way people do when they've expected fury and instead received precision, and I understood watching her face that the composure, the specificity, the refusal to be reduced to a wailing cliché, was its own kind of weapon, sharper by far than anything I could have screamed at him across a dinner table. I confronted Nathaniel 2 days later, on a Saturday morning in our own kitchen, with the coffee he loved brewing on the counter and the late autumn light coming in gold across the marble the way it always did. The light I had once thought was the most beautiful thing about our apartment and now understood was simply the last thing to know the truth. I did not raise my voice. I laid the folder on the counter beside his coffee cup and I said, Adrian Voss called the ring's original jeweler for a repair in April. I've spoken to them directly. I watched something in his face go very still, the particular stillness of a man recalculating an entire structure in real time, searching for the load-bearing wall that might still be intact. Margot. Auguste is beautiful, I said. I saw a photograph from his birthday. He has your chin. He set his coffee cup down very carefully, the way you set something down when your hands have started almost imperceptibly to shake, and for a moment, one single moment, and I want to be honest that I noticed it, that some small unhealed part of me registered it even as the rest of me stood entirely apart from it. I saw real fear cross his face, and beneath the fear something that might have been shame. How long have you known? He said. It wasn't really a question. Long enough to trace 41 wire transfers. Long enough to know the Cole Arts Initiative was funded partly through my mother's foundation. Long enough to have Denise Ruiz build a case that could end your career if I decide I wanted to. I kept my voice level. I had practiced this alone in the mirror of my own bathroom, the way I had once helped actors practice the hardest scene of a play, the one where the character finally says the thing they've been circling for 2 acts. I'm not here to ask you why, Nathaniel. I know why. You wanted a child and I couldn't give you one fast enough, and somewhere along the way you decided that, instead of telling me the truth, you would simply go build a second life where the truth wasn't required. That's not, he started and then stopped, because I think even he understood there was no ending to that sentence that wasn't a lie. I'm not here to fight about the marriage, I said. The marriage is over. It's been over since April, when you had my mother's ring resized for another woman. I'm here to tell you what happens next, and I need you to listen very carefully, because I am only going to say it once. I told him about the foundation repayment, the full amount plus interest, due within 90 days, structured through Harold so there would be no ambiguity and no negotiation. I told him about the prenup, the infidelity and fraud clauses Denise had already begun preparing, clauses he had signed 11 years earlier believing they would never apply to him because he had, at the time, so little to lose. I told him that the productions currently running would not be touched, that I had thought carefully about the crews and the casts and had no interest in punishing 200 working artists for the sins of one producer, but that any future production bearing his name would need to survive without foundation money, without my name attached to it in any way, publicly or privately, ever again. And then I told him the thing that I think in the end cost him more than any of it. I'm not going to fight you for custody arrangements with August, or try to keep you from him, I said. That boy didn't choose any of this, and he shouldn't lose his father because his father is a liar. But you will never bring him into any space that has my name on it. Not the foundation, not this apartment, not a single gala, not a single opening night I might attend. You built him a whole world, Nathaniel. You can live in it. You just don't get to live in mine anymore. He didn't argue. I think by then he understood there was nothing left to argue with. The kitchen was very quiet, the coffee going cold on the counter between us, the gold October light sliding slowly across the marble the way it had that first morning, indifferent to all of it, and I remember thinking with a strange and sudden clarity that this was the last time I would ever stand in this kitchen as his wife, and that I felt, more than anything else, relieved. The divorce took 4 months to finalize, faster than anyone expected, largely because Nathaniel's attorneys understood, once they'd reviewed Denise's file, exactly how much worse things could get for him if this went to a courtroom instead of a conference table. The foundation was repaid in full, with interest, within the 90 days I'd specified. Priscilla Okafor resigned from the production company 2 weeks after the story broke, quietly, through a trade publication that ran a careful lawyered paragraph about financial irregularities, without ever using words like fraud or mistress, because I had, in the end, decided I did not need the world to know the whole shape of it. I did not need Adrienne Cole's career destroyed in the tabloids, though it did not survive intact regardless. A producer's mistress with a mysteriously funded rise is not a secret that theater people, gossiping animals that we are, keep for long, prenup or no prenup, once a divorce filing becomes public record. I kept the Hamptons house. I kept the foundation which I still run and which now funds, among other things, a scholarship program for young theater artists who don't have family names or family money behind them, the thing I once foolishly believed Adrienne Cole to be, before I understood that she had simply been the beneficiary of a different kind of unearned advantage, one built on my own blindness. I never met August. I think about him sometimes more than I expected to. This small boy who exists at the exact intersection of my worst year and someone else's best one. I hope, in the plain and complicated way you hope for a stranger's child, that he grows up loved, and that whatever his father tells him about how he came into the world leaves out the parts that would hurt him to know. As for the ring, I had Harold's office send a formal letter to Adrienne Cole's attorney. I did not ask for it back out of spite, though I understand if that's what it looks like from the outside. I asked for it back because it was never Nathaniel's to give away. It had been my mother's, and before that, her mother's, carried across an ocean and 3 generations of women who had, each of them, weathered things I was only beginning to understand. I came from a long line of surviving. The ring arrived by courier 6 weeks after the divorce was finalized, in a small velvet box with no note. I opened it alone in the library of the Hamptons house in early spring light instead of autumn gold, and I sat with it in my palm for a long time before I put it back in the safe. Not for a daughter I would likely never have, but for myself, a reminder, cut and set in rose gold, that some things survive the people who try to steal them. I am 45 years old now. I run a foundation with my mother's name on it, a name that means once again exactly what it says. I did not remarry, though I am not opposed to the idea in the abstract, the way you're not opposed to a country you've simply decided not to visit again soon. Nathaniel produces regional theater now, mostly in Chicago, mostly small houses, and I understand from mutual friends I've kept that he is, by all accounts, a devoted father to August, which is the one part of this story I am glad, despite everything, turned out to be true. I think often about the 11 minutes I sat at my desk with that magazine open, not moving, not breathing, the moment before I understood that my entire life had been a production I wasn't given the script to. I think about how easy it would have been to scream that day, to confront him raw and furious and unprepared, and hand him, in my grief, the exact advantage he needed to survive it. I did not do that. I did the other thing instead, the quiet thing, the patient thing, the thing that took 3 weeks and 41 wire transfers and 8 years of buried documents to build. I became, for one autumn, the architect of my own reckoning, the way he had once been the architect of my ruin, and when the curtain finally came down on the life I thought I'd been living, I was the one who decided exactly how and exactly when it fell.